listening to Proof Text, a Glossa House podcast by Dr. T. Michael W. Halcomb, Dr. Frederick J. Long, Dr. Mario Melendez, Dr. Jennifer Noonan, and J. M. Smith. Welcome and enjoy.
Shalom. This is Dr. Jennifer Noonan, and welcome to this week's episode of SLA Insights. So last week I was talking about language proficiency or proficiency in language acquisition. This week I'm going to start breaking that definition down a bit. So this week we're going to focus on implicit language knowledge, look at it in a little more detail. And in the upcoming episodes, we're going to talk about explicit language knowledge and automaticity. So just as a quick review, I want to give you the definition of language proficiency, but if you get a chance to listen to last week's episode, you can do that. It might help bring you up to speed so you're ready for this week's. So, quick definition of language proficiency according to Holstein. Language proficiency incorporates the following three components. First, proficiency includes implicit knowledge of phonetics, prosody, phonology, morphology, and syntax. Second, proficiency involves vocabulary mastery, which is largely explicit in its form, meaning, connections. And finally, the first two elements of proficiency must be combined with automaticity. So today we're going to just pull out that implicit knowledge piece. And Holstein talks about implicit knowledge of phonetics, prosody, phonology, morphology, and syntax. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on those, but those are the things that if you've had a language class, you've been studying, sometimes consciously, but we're talking this week about the implicit or unconscious acquisition of those elements of the language. So to talk a little bit further about implicit knowledge, it's knowing without having to think or reflect on what you know. It's the language knowledge we use every day when we communicate in our native language without knowing or referring to any formal rule. So it's not memorization of paradigms or grammar rules. We'll talk more about that next week with the explicit knowledge. So if we want to break this down a little further, we're talking about unconscious language knowledge. It's knowledge that the learner knows and uses, but without any conscious reflection on what he or she knows. So the knowledge, not only that, is often inaccessible to the learner. The learner doesn't know or isn't fully aware that they know what they know. It's often acquired, and that is they internalize it without realizing it. They're not trying to. They just take it in. It's intuitive knowledge, so that the language that they use is edited by feel rather than by thinking through a specific rule that needs to be applied in that situation. So let me give you a few examples here. First, if we talk a receptive example, in other words, you're listening or reading, if someone were to say mouses in English, any native English speaker would cringe if it's someone he knows should know better, or they might laugh if it's a young child. They automatically know that's not right, okay? They don't know why. They don't remember learning it. They don't have to reflect on it. They just know. That's not how you say that. You'd say mice. Now, in a productive example, perhaps you're talking and without thinking, you started to say the quiet, little cute girl. And then you go, the quiet, cute little girl. You would automatically rearrange it because you know the rule, you feel it, you know what you said was wrong. You don't know why, but you have that language knowledge implicitly, intuitively within you. And so you feel that incorrectness, even though most native English speakers could not tell you why they know it's wrong, right? Another way of looking at implicit knowledge is we're talking about procedural knowledge, almost like muscle memory. So most adults who are healthy, strong, can walk without thinking about it. An accomplished pianist can play scales without thinking about it. A professional basketball player can do layups without thinking about it. You just do it. You've done it so many times. You just know. You don't have to think about the rules. It's already within you. You just do it. Another aspect that we need to look at with implicit language knowledge is that it's usually developmental. In other words, certain things need to be learned before other things can be learned. There are predictable sequences about how these are learned. And this is not something we talk a lot about unless you're in language teaching English as a second language. And there's been a ton of research that's been done about language learning sequences in English L2, that is second language learners for English. Unfortunately, the same amount of research has not been done, to my knowledge, for Hebrew, for Greek, or for any of the other ancient languages. It can be assumed that those languages are learned in developmental sequences. We just don't know what those are yet at this point. So if anyone's looking for a dissertation topic, there you go. Start researching developmental sequences for ancient languages. But it's this type of language knowledge, this implicit, intuitive, procedural, developmental language knowledge that results in acquisition or knowledge of the language. And that's to be contrasted with learning about the language or knowledge about the language. And if we were to briefly contrast explicit language knowledge, we can start to see some of the differences. And again, next week, I'll go into more detail about explicit language knowledge. But to contrast, explicit language knowledge is conscious knowledge where you can think about it, you can reflect on it, you know what you know because you can think about and reflect what you know. You can also talk about what you know. It can be verbalized, it can be articulated. You know the rules, you know you add an S or whatever the rule is. And if you're going to use the language knowledge, it's usually edited by what's called the monitor, the language monitor, a conscious language reflection that says, okay, in this situation, I need to use this construction with this ending, and that's going to get me to say what I need to say. Or when you're reading, going, okay, this has that ending, so it must mean this. That's conscious, explicit language knowledge, rather than editing by feel, where you just know, you read it and you feel it. So today's topic has been implicit language knowledge. And how does that relate to ancient languages? What's the difference? Why do we care? Why should we even have the goal of learning the languages, the ancient languages, implicitly? Well, let me ask you a few questions. What if you could read Greek as quickly as you read English? What if you could understand Latin as well as you understand your mother tongue? What if you could interpret the intent of a Hebrew author just as well as you interpret the daily news? What would that do for exegesis? How would that free you as a student of the Bible and the other ancient texts? And so I would encourage you to think big for yourself and for your students, because I think that implicit learning of ancient languages is within the realm of possibilities. And I think if we can get there, and some have, that it's really going to open up the possibilities for exegesis and for studying the Bible and understanding the scriptures. So, in conclusion, and by a quick review here, I'm in the midst of this kind of mini-series on language proficiency, or proficiency in language acquisition. Today we talked in more detail about implicit language knowledge, what it is, how it works. Next week's episode is going to focus on explicit language knowledge and how that contributes to proficiency, because it does play a role. And then in future episodes, we'll look at the connection, the interface between implicit and explicit knowledge. In other words, can you learn something explicitly and turn it into implicit knowledge and vice versa? And then automaticity. And we'll probably spend a couple episodes on automaticity because it's really complex and really a fascinating piece of research that's been done on automaticity, especially in language learning. So next week, I'll see you back here for explicit knowledge, and look forward to continue learning with you. Have a great week.
Interested in growing your ancient language skills but not sure where to start? Glossa House can help. From illustrated readers and short stories to lexicons and grammars, Glossa House offers a variety of resources for beginning, intermediate, and experienced ancient language learners. Head to glossahouse.com today. Glossa House, language resources for the global community.